This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, gets today's show rolling with a grain market outlook. Dan mentions reports that'll be coming out soon and how he sees old crop sales. Continuing the show is Micah Cameron-Harp, K-State postdoctoral fellow in agricultural economics, discussing research that evaluated how technology adoption for irrigation impacted water use in the past 20 years. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond ends the show as he talks about the range in temperatures Kansas has seen and also forecasts what September could bring. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, what are we seeing for the futures market?
Well, we're seeing a continuation of the situation that's pretty bearish at the moment. Again, there's a crop tour that's happening across the Corn Belt, looking at corn and soybean outcomes, and so far, I'd say there's some mixed results. Parts of the country to the north and South Dakota and up into Minnesota, et cetera. They're talking about pretty good yield prospects, but still some underlying issues to look at. Challenges over in Ohio, still to be dealt with. Generally, very good reports though in Indiana. I think they're coming towards the last day or so here when of that report. We'll get right into the heart of the Corn Belt. I don't doubt that'll look pretty good. You know, over here in Kansas, we have our ups and downs. Still, things not finalized. So just because that crop report makes a statement, it's still not the end of the marketing year. I think overall we still are. We're coming up to the September 1 time period by which the USDA will they'll be out in the fields, objective yield surveys on the one hand, farmer surveys on the other. Will be another week or so down the road. And we're aiming right now in the futures markets to trying to assess where we'll come out on the September 12th crop production WASDE report. And so that's a big deal. I would just mention, because we're talking about dates of information, also as we're looking at September 1, that there are also surveys going out from the USDA to look at I guess wheat production. There'll be a small grains production report that'll come out into September. A stocks report that's coming into play. So anyway, anymore within a low price situation like we've got on the futures markets, the thing we're anticipating, hoping for, it's positive news, is that low prices will help to spur usage. And I would say, you know, we're in a time when we've been looking at so much negative news, there are some positive shoots out there. Green shoots, I think they call them in the financial markets. On the wheat side, we've had prices have gotten low enough, apparently, where the U.S. hard red winter wheat sales pretty strong. Really, we had for the week ending August the 15th, we had 8.4 million bushels of actual shipment movement, and that's compared to a rate of about 4.8 that we need to meet the USDA's projection. So it's not great news that prices are low, but we have gotten down to the place where we're moving some wheat, and you still have these international factors that I think I heard Seth Meyer at USDA chief economist at our Risk and Profit a week or so ago say that the wheat market is confusing given how tight it is, but yet prices being as low as they are. So it's something to be watchful that we're starting to see movement and still uncertainty, and anything but a stable situation over the Black Sea region. If anything, it's starting to destabilize all that much more. So anyway, at least just from reading the news and observations, so that's an issue. So you're asking about the wheat futures. Grain futures. Yesterday, September closed 371. Dees, new crop Dees, 393 and a half. Both those down about 4 cents. Soybeans, November, 961 and a half. September contract, 941 and a quarter. So again, both those below 10. Both the corn contracts up front below 4. For wheat, we're below 5 550, I guess, for those first two contracts. September, 529.25. Dees, the Dees contract, 545, and that also down about 6 3/4, 7 cents. The soybean numbers were down about 20. So I guess I would just say that in so many years, you look back historically, and the market gets to this place in time where it's been so focused on production prospects on the supply side, and when a large crop comes on and we're really not focusing even yet on the usage side, that we have tended to see lows around late August, especially early September. And gosh, that seems to be the human psychology we're following right now. And maybe if you have time at the end of this today, we can talk about where that leaves producers in terms of the types of actions that they can take, if they have old crop on the one hand, if they have new crop on the other.
And Dan, what are we seeing for some prices when it comes to cash?
Well, corn prices, cash corn, you still see strength in what strength there is out in Garden City area. 437, 66 cent over basis, positive basis as of on Thursday's closes. You still see a 401 in Colby, 408 in the Hutchinson area, Salina, Topeka, Columbus, all below 4. Interesting that when you look at ethanol plant prices, that the only average price for a state in the United States for corn prices, that's over $4. The only average is Kansas at basically 410. There are some others whose top end range comes in over 4, just barely. The range in Kansas, 388.25 to about to 423.25. So that low price going into ethanol plants has been helping the profitability of ethanol. So that's a positive. Again, you're supporting that demand base to see what support usage on that will show up probably in the quarterly stocks report on down the road. So anyway, not just trying to conjure up or think of positive news, but it is good to keep in mind that we're so focused on the supply side right now, but it's the demand side is being supported by these low prices, both in ethanol and in the export side. We'll see where the feed use comes in. I think that the feed use will go, as we heard Glenn Tonser talk about at the Risk and Profit conference a week or so ago. That'll depend on livestock numbers, because the cost is cheap. It's just a matter of the numbers in feedlots of hogs, poultry, et cetera, to keep all that going. I would say for other crops, you do have some areas where you have a little stronger wheat prices than others. The Hutchinson area, 539, 10 over. Salina, 524, only 5 under. 519 in Topeka, 10 under. But again, Colby, Garden City, and Columbus all under $5. Soybean prices, again, if there's an overall thought in the market that nobody's arguing with, is that, gosh, it looks like a good year for soybeans. So the soybean cash prices have been suffering their strongest cash prices in the state. On yesterday's close, 944 Hutchinson at 3 over, 942 at Topeka. That's the top bid in that area, 1 over. Well, pardon me, not 935 bids, 6 under in Columbus, and 917. But again, you're kind of talking about the new crop. Those are the spot bids when the crop is in here. In all those locations for corn, for soybeans, you've got generally a lower price, at least a moderately lower price for harvest. At this time, anticipation of harvest low. I want to mention grain sorghum. The top price in the state, Hutchinson and Salina, both at 384 for the cash price. And that's a positive basis, 387 in the Colby area. So we've got really some pretty good basis bids. It's just that the lead contract for grain sorghum, for corn, that grain sorghum gets priced off of is again at 371. So you've got that type of situation.
And Dan, you mentioned it beforehand and talking about it now. Do we give up on old crop sales?
Well, that is the issue that I think I hear people, professional market commentators, market advisors are talking about making bin space basically for the new crop harvest. If our time window is from here till October 1, when we see that most of the Corn Belt start to move higher, then we'd have to have a surprise probably in the September crop report to bring us a lot higher, or something unforeseen coming out of the world situation. I don't know that it's not the right season for that to happen out of South America. If there's anything that could bring that type of upheaval, that's probably the Middle East and Black Sea region conflicts. But absent that, it's hard to sit here and anticipate something that give us a great big jolt. So when right after we say that, probably have to eat those words. And I probably, from a grain marketer point of view, I'd gladly eat those words in the next, not 30 days, but generally it looks pretty rough. If someone does carry over from one year to the next, you've got it's a cash flow financial decision. Do they need the cash or not? Do they have the storage? But keep wondering about the possibility of an upward move, and that possibility remains. But the window is closing on it, and it's getting to the place now where there's a big enough crop anticipated to come that you'd have to have almost a geopolitical issue, a larger economy-wide issue that would affect the financial markets, make the commodity markets move, and raise prices. So I think no doubt here we're talking about it now, Shelby, but ag producers have been looking at that for a good while. As I drive across the state, I see trucks moving. Generally, probably the need for storage space to take what cash they can, move on, and get ready for the next go around is probably what's going on for a lot of folks.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us and give us our grain market update.
Shelby, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to work with you on this.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we're talking about a research project titled Efficiency and Water Use, Dynamic Effects of Irrigation Technology Adoption today with K-State postdoctoral fellow in agricultural economics, Micah Cameron-Harp. Micah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Micah, taking a look into irrigation technology adoption, and can you give us some background to this research?
Absolutely. So this project started about 2020, and I was during my PhD wanting to look at some of these really important questions of what happens with this scarce resource, groundwater in Kansas, when irrigators change the technology they're using to apply water. So we decided that we were going to use some data that we are very fortunate to have in Kansas on withdrawals at the well level and try to tackle this question in a really empirical, data-driven way.
And something really important to Kansas because groundwater is really vital to our western Kansas farmers.
Absolutely. So something like $33 billion worth of industry outputs in Kansas are reliant on groundwater resources. So it's an incredibly important resource here in Kansas.
Wanting to take a look into those irrigation types and see what happened when producers went from one to the other, and starting off looking into flood irrigation versus center pivot irrigation.
Yeah, so the first conversion that we looked at was this conversion from flood or furrow irrigation, where water is allowed to flow down in between the rows of crops, to center pivot irrigation, which if you've flown over the Midwest, you've probably seen the nice center pivot circles. That was the first conversion we decided to look at because it's been a little bit understudied, and we know that there are fairly large changes in the efficiency. So you can imagine letting water flow down the rows between crops. There's going to be a fair amount that gets evaporated before it reaches the root zone. Whereas a center pivot system is going to deliver that water closer to the soil and perhaps reduce that evaporative loss.
And what effects did you see when people went from one irrigation type to the next?
So for this first transition that we studied from flood irrigation to center pivot irrigation, we saw that irrigators reduced their withdrawals, their pumping of groundwater, by about 10% the first year that they make the change, which is a pretty massive reduction, right? the other interesting thing that we found is that their irrigated acreage remained relatively constant after the conversion, whereas if you compare that to people who remained using flood irrigation, their irrigated acreage fell over time. So what this tells us is that the conversion from flood irrigation to center pivot irrigation allowed them to extend the use of that resource and maintain irrigating.
Taking a look now into when people transition from center pivot irrigation to low energy precision application irrigation.
Yeah, so for the second conversion, we studied those converting from a traditional center pivot system to a low energy precision application irrigation system where the nozzles are going to be closer to the ground and it's to reduce drift and evaporative loss. And what we found there was a little bit different. So in the short term, there are very minimal effects. Right? For the first conversion, we found in the short term large, that 10% effect. Here, with the adoption of LIPA, statistically insignificant effects in the near term. However, about 2 decades later, we see a statistically significant reduction in withdrawals. So what that tells us is that the change in efficiency is smaller in magnitude between those two systems. And so in order to detect that long-term, small, minute difference, we need about 20 years worth of data.
How did acreage change for producers who went from center pivot to LIPA?
So with that, we noticed a small increase in irrigated acreage. So relative to the individuals that stayed in traditional center pivots, it looks like there might have been a very slight expansion of irrigated acreage. But in general, that effect was relatively insignificant and small.
And Micah, within all this, also wanting to talk about depth applied, something you talk about in this paper, and can you share with us what is that?
Sure. Depth applied is a measure of irrigation intensity. So it's total quantity over area. And you can think about this as the amount of water that's really needed to fulfill a crop's evapotranspirational needs. So depth applied, if I'm able to apply a foot of water and have the same output of crops as when I used to have to apply, let's say, 18 inches, that means a lot more of that water is now actually being effectively used by the crop.
And so seeing that our technology improvements when it comes to irrigation is beneficial for our crop production?
What it is allowing producers to do is adapt to changing production conditions, right? So with this change in efficiency, what it's allowing those that converted from flood irrigation to center pivot to do is maintain producing crops, right? Prolong the use of that groundwater resource, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're producing more. Similarly, with the conversion to LIPA, we see pretty minimal changes. So instead, what it appears like from our data and our results is that it really allows them to make these small adjustments that prolong the life of that resource and let them make little fine-tuning tweaks here and there.
And all this coming to an economic question we talked a little bit about before we started the broadcast.
Yes, so one of the underlying motivations for this paper is the question of what happens with a scarce resource when you increase the efficiency with which you can use it. So let's say oil, groundwater in Kansas. There is a hypothesis that if you become more efficient at extracting the resource, you may actually use more of it because you've reduced the marginal cost or how much it costs you to extract that resource. If there is a productive use of that resource, you now might extract even more and increase your profit margin there. And that's called Jevons paradox. And it's a paradox because usually typical thinking would be more efficient means less use of the resource. Jevons, though, hypothesized the opposite could happen, specifically thinking about coal and the kind of first industrial revolution. Now, what we find in Kansas is that our results do not support Jevons' hypothesis, right? There is an increase in efficiency with both these conversions, but instead we see a reduction in withdrawals, very significant and immediate in the one case for flood to center pivot, and smaller and in the long run for a center pivot to LIPA. So our results instead suggest that this change in efficiency really did allow producers to prolong using that scarce resource.
Micah, what are some key takeaways from this paper then and all this research you've done on irrigation technology adoption?
Big takeaways for me is if we look at the difference in results between these two technologies, the change in efficiency that is projected for both of them is greater than what we observe in our results. So yes, we didn't see this paradoxical Jevons paradox effect, but the savings that we see don't match up with what you might expect given estimates from engineering publications about efficiencies of these systems. So to me, what that says is when we're thinking about adoption of these technologies, we have to take some of those projections with a grain of salt. Because, number one, they're going to be estimates, but number two, producers are going to make adjustments, right? So perhaps I don't save all of those efficiency gains. Perhaps I make slightly smaller of a cut than I could if I really, truly realize the efficiency gains. Doing that allows me to still maintain production. Another big takeaway is if we compare the systems, with flood to center pivot, we see an immediate big reduction, right? For center pivot to LIPA, insignificant effects in the near term. We only really notice things about 2 decades later. It says two things. Number one, that sometimes the effects of technology adoption are going to take a long time for us to recognize. Number two, that those impacts are a function of the change in efficiency. So the difference in efficiencies from a flood system to a center pivot system is about 20%. From center pivot to LIPA, it'd be around 5%. Notice difference in the magnitude of those changes, and then the difference in our results, right? Larger change in efficiency, immediate impact on water use, the case from flood to center pivot. Smaller change in efficiency takes much longer to notice the adjustment from center pivot to LIPA.
If people would like to read more on this research, how could they do that?
So they can go to my website, mcameron.harp.com, I believe. They can shoot me an email, mcameron.harp@ksu.edu, and I'd be happy to share the paper. And it's also online as well at the journal that's been published, the Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists.
Micah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That was Kansas State University post-doctoral fellow in agricultural economics, Micah Cameron-Harp. If you're wanting to find this research paper titled Efficiency and Water Use, Dynamic Effects of Irrigation Technology Adoption, there are a few different ways you can find it. You can go to mcameron.harp.com, send him an email at mcameron.harp@ksu.edu, or I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back from our break, we'll be joined by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with this week's weather update. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, we've had quite the combination of weather this past week, and first, taking a look back at last weekend where some places were pretty warm.
Yeah, for certain places we were warm last weekend. There was a pretty impressive dividing line across from northwest Kansas down to southeast Kansas. And folks to the south and west were really, really hot. We saw temperatures up to 110. We saw 111 out there in Ness County. And then to the east of that, we saw temperatures much cooler. We had thunderstorm activity. We even had some places not even get out of the 60s in northeast Kansas. So pretty substantial temperature change as you drove across the state on Sunday especially. And then we had cooler weather move in after that, and we had cooler weather before that, but just one day of pretty impressive heat in the southwest. And that can do some pretty substantial damage with just how warm it got. And then the humidity was very low, too. Very, very dry air. We had humidity down in the afternoon into the teens with some breezy winds. And so that's just a nasty combination that can dry things out pretty quickly, and especially considering the amount of moisture that area has had this year. A little concerned that some of the crops didn't have roots possibly down as far as they could have, and maybe weren't able to adjust as quickly to the heat, and therefore we could potentially see some crop issues in that neck of the woods in the southwestern part of the state, just with the substantial amount of heat that they had that one brief day.
Are we going to see more precipitation moving forward, Chip?
Yes, the precipitation this week's been really scattered. It's been, in some areas, have gotten a lot of rain, and we look at the drought monitor, we had improvements just hopscotch all over the state in this particular areas. Most notably, some areas in the northeastern part of the state got into an inch or two of rain, and there's parts in the southwest that still got, even before that heat, Ness County and Rush County had over an inch of rain. And so some folks have been getting it where the folks that were really, really dry in the southwest and south along the Oklahoma border, and then north central Kansas too along the Nebraska border, those areas continue to be very dry, and they need widespread moisture. And unfortunately, when we look at the forecast of the next coming week, don't see really much opportunity for widespread precipitation. We still have some monsoonal moisture in the southwest that's lingering, but overall it's slowly starting to deplete. And that means that our source of moisture is going to become more limited with any of these storm complexes that we see, and so therefore the coverage of thunderstorm activity is going to be less. So I think overall, by this time next week, we'll be looking at things drier than what we were over the course of the last few weeks. And with temperatures on the rise, especially this weekend, we're going to see temperatures reach the 100-degree mark again. We'll moderate the temperatures somewhat into next week, but still above average with warmer than normal and drier than normal conditions. Definitely going to be some additional stressors to the ag community.
If we look at the drought monitor then, some degradation and improvements?
Yeah, we still have pretty substantial drought across the state where most of the state is in D0 or worse drought conditions, and we still have about 50% of the state in moderate or worse drought conditions. So while we have seen some improvements that have been localized, and drought continues to expand in the areas that have missed precipitation over the last week.
As we take a peek into September, what can we maybe be expecting for that month?
That's a great question. Something that we've been debating here a lot in our office is that with that monsoonal moisture depleting, and like it seasonally does, we don't see monsoon activity last into September. I think overall our precipitation opportunities are going to become slim. There is slight favor in the western part of the state of maybe some weak monsoonal storms pushing east off the higher terrain in the evenings. But overall, for most of central and southeast Kansas, things look like they're going to be dry going into September. And with warmer than normal temperatures sticking around, definitely a change from what we've seen over the last few weeks.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us once again and give us our weather update.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.